Welcome, everyone. I'm Margaret Scott. I'm with the New York Southeast Asia Network, and we are thrilled and a bit amazed at the timing of this webinar about Malaysian politics. And we have the perfect panel to delve into this dramatic, head-spinning series of events that are unfolding now in Malaysia and have been for the past many months. First, I need to put out a couple of thank yous. The New York Southeast Asian Network is a sponsor, as is the Wagner School of New York University and the Nordic Institute of Asian Studies. I urge everyone on this webinar, and it's wonderful how many are on it, to go to the New York Southeast Asian Network's new website and sign up for our newsletter. One of the remarkable and the only good thing I can think of about this pandemic is that the opening up of the virtual world, and therefore all of you can participate in our many events, and we list other people's events as well. On October 7th in New York and October 8th in Asia, for instance, the network will be hosting a very important program on the legacy of the mass killings in Indonesia by the authors of two very important new books. But now to tonight in New York and the morning in Malaysia, in our distinguished panel. Each will speak for 5 to 7 minutes. I'm hoping they will engage in a bit of conversation after that, and then we will open to all of you for questions. Because there's so many of you, we're going to be using a chat function, and I'm going to monitor the questions, and I will try to keep track and get to all of them. So our first speaker hardly needs much introduction. She's one of the leading experts on Malaysian politics, Meredith Weiss. She's the chair of political science at the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy at the University of Albany, the State University of New York. She is most recently the author of The Roots of Resilience, Party Machines, and Grassroots Politics in Southeast Asia, and co-editor, I don't know if I'm on camera, but of this book, Towards a New Malaysia, which was one of the reasons why we gave the title of this talk about New Malaysia, and who knows what that New Malaysia is anymore. And then next, also doesn't need much introduction. I'm sure all of you know him, Sharad Khutan, a senior anchor with Astro Awani TV and host of an English language current affairs show. He's also the co-director of the Georgetown Literary Festival, which I find fantastic. And also he's a longtime journalist. And our third speaker is Ibrahim Ben Sufyan. He's the co-founder and programs director of the Merdeka Center for Opinion Research, Malaysia's leading polling firm. And he, boy, will be the man in the hot seat, depending on how things unravel. And he's recently been in Sabah, and there's an upcoming election, so I'm very much looking forward to Ben's comments. And without further ado, Meredith is going to fill us in on what's going on and what it all means. Meredith.
Okay, thanks, Margaret, and thanks to you, Anit, for organizing everything. And I will just start with the caveat that anything any of us say tonight or this morning, depending on where you are, may be completely incorrect by the time we're done saying it, but that's how Malaysian politics is these days. So I'll start with just a brief overview of where we are, what was supposed to be the new Malaysia, and why we might not get there. I'm assuming most of you who are here are at least largely familiar, so this will be fairly sketchy. But to put it all in brief, the Pakatan Harapan coalition was elected in May 2018. It collapsed just under 2 years later, the end of February of this year. And then the Perikatan Nasional, which is the remaining parties of the BN, the Barisan Nasional, which had been in government since actually before independence, as the alliance, together with the Pan-Malaysian Islamist Party, that's PAS, and then parts of two parties that were in Pakatan, so Bersatu and Keadilan, and some parties that were allied from Sabah and Sarawak and East Malaysia. All of those consolidated under Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin, with a perilously slim majority. So it was seen as, depending on your perspective, a parliamentary or a royal coup to unseat one government and announce another one. But as of early March, that was the government. Coronavirus was tipping up in Malaysia at precisely the same time, literally the same week. And so in some ways, the government's initial tasks were just so focused on that there wasn't so much time to realize that there was no actual program to Perikatan Nasional, to PN, besides just staying in power. And there's really nothing that clearly holds the coalition together apart from maintaining enough seats to have a majority in parliament and perhaps Malay rights. So that part doesn't really fit with the East Malaysian side of the coalition either. So in fact, politics since then has been really a pretty crazy game, with a plague of frogs or party hoppers, the coronavirus to make everything all the more fraught, corruption cases on all sides, the 1MDB case is going to trial finally, as well as now charges on the other side against Lim Guaneng and others from the Pakatan side. Importantly, it's worth saying that the Director General, in particular of the Health Ministry, kept the COVID response going in the interregnum. And so the pandemic has not been a halcyon time for civil liberties in Malaysia, or it turns out for really equitable enforcement of the regulations put in place under movement control order, and then it's stepping down since then. Those efforts, once implemented, did help immensely in containing the spread. There's an uptick now, as in many places, but ultimately it seems that management of the pandemic probably helped the government, just because it was a good thing. In terms of the parties, it took some time for Bersatu, Mahathir's party, to settle out after the big split. Eventually, most of the party joined with UMNO and PAS in Muafakat Nasional, which is really the predecessor to Perikatan Nasional. I'm sorry if this is all confusing. It just inherently is. Muafakat had formalized as a coalition in late 2019, a few months before this big shift. UMNO, as one of the two main parties in that, Bersatu is a third wheel, has resisted formalizing its membership in Perikatan, and now we may see why, if it's true, and I might leave this to Ben to talk more about, that UMNO may be fragmenting and joining Anwar in a new coalition, which we might find out about again as this webinar proceeds. So Mahathir and his inner circle, his son and others, have formed a new party called Pejuang. One of his acolytes, Syed Saddiq, has formed a youth party called Muda. So we have some fractionalization among parties. There's a fair amount of overlap in terms of the ground they cover. Muda is somewhat different. It's not definite that they're actually registered with an organization, but it is mostly Malay. It's multiracial. It's a youth party designed to focus more on issues and young people than on ethnicity. And then the other big thing to mention before I just give a quick overview of reforms and so forth that won't happen is what's happening right now, which is the Sabah state elections. And this was because of yet more confusion of party hopping and coups and so forth. But basically there's what's called the Warisan Plus coalition, which is allied with Pakatan versus essentially a Perikatan allied coalition versus a crazy number of independents. So I think it's something like an average of 6 contestants for every seat, because why not? But Ben will clarify all of that perfectly in a few minutes. And then there's this drama since yesterday revolving around a rumor, initially that the Sarawak coalition GPS would pull away from Perikatan and join with Pakatan, and now it's not GPS, but rather UMNO. But anyway, Anwar may or may not have enough seats to form a government. That may or may not happen today. This isn't the first time he's thought he had seats to form a government. I don't know. I'm going to let Ben or Sharad answer that. So what's at stake now? Pakatan came in on a protest vote against Najib and some amount of proactive support for reform. PAS the Islamist Party had about 1/3 of the Malay vote and was also instrumental to ousting the BN. So this wasn't a clear coalition for a mandate for reform. I'll note just very briefly 4 areas for which the change of government this year, the reversal of that 2018 change, has been or likely will be especially salient, at least if the PN government that's in place as of this moment and may remain in place stays in power. So the first is personalities. There was a chance with the new government for a set of new leaders. So not all, I mean, Mahathir, the prime minister under Pakatan, certainly was anything but a new leader. He is both elderly himself and old hand at leading the government. Anwar and so forth, also, not new faces. But there was a somewhat more multiracial group of leadership. There were some strong women in the mix. Now we have a number of people who were amongst the kind of old guard leaders in new positions within Pakatan who are now in new positions in the PN. So people like Prime Minister Muhyiddin, Saifuddin Abdullah, and others are back full circle. They were in the BN, they were in Pakatan, now they're in the PN, the Perikatan Nasional. UMNO is underrepresented in the current leadership, and so they may be coming back by another means. The courts have found Najib, the former prime minister, guilty for 1MDB charges, but he seems amazingly confident of his own ultimate exoneration. And meanwhile, Anwar and Lim Guaneg of the Democratic Action Party are back in court, or about to be, for the same charges as before, essentially, like really. So really there's a sense of deja vu, again, with just some musical chairs, but the great shift of personalities probably isn't going to happen. Second area, ethnic politics. Pakistan had promoted a new approach, at least discursively, if not actually in policies, and more so before Mahathir and his Bersatu party joined. But the common denominator, to the peninsular side at least, of Pakistan was to be a kind of a new model of how ethnicity features in government, whereas under Barisan Nasional, especially on the peninsula, this is a Malay Muslim ethno-nationalist coalition. So a Malaysia vision, however you might label it, seems all the more elusive now, even if the power that Sabah and Sarawak have to control to be a kingmaker role shake things up a bit. Third area, again, going really quickly, institutional reforms, everything from civil liberties to elections. I think Sharad will talk more about this in a moment. So Pakistan had convened a whole set of high-level councils and committees, or empowered some strong-willed reformist leaders, so it was still somewhat personalistic, but different, to dive into anti-corruption measures, electoral reform, judicial reform, parliamentary reform, and more. Barisan Nasional, the current, at this moment, government, has offered no such agenda, or really any agenda, and seems disinclined to pursue those specific changes. Pakistan had already fallen short of many supporters' expectations, with the slow pace of and fumbles in addressing civil liberties, backtracking, or vacillation on things like local government elections and so forth. Some of the changes that they did make may stick, like parliamentary select committees, or the fact that there was actually a bipartisan amendment that passed for the first time ever to lower the voting age to 18 and facilitate voter registration. Other areas like electoral reform seem to probably come full stop with the turnover. Lastly, and especially germane right now, issues of states' rights. So this is especially germane for Sabah, but the ongoing mix of state governments, different coalitions, and different compositions for coalitions in power at different states suggests that this arena will continue to matter and to evolve. There are contests over state versus federal power. This is really stark now in Sabah, as Muhyiddin is saying everything out loud about how Sabahans would do well to make nice with the federal government if their state wants to get any more money. But there's a real question of whether Barisan will do better or worse for East Malaysia in terms of renegotiating the federation agreement, or bringing Malaysia back to its original 1963 guarantees, or how effectively either state can turn its kingmaker status to its own empowerment, or what might happen among other states. Okay, so I'm going to end there with that sketchy overview and turn things over to Ben, who will make everything clear with numbers about attitudes on government and what is happening in East Malaysia.
Wonderful, thank you. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you so much for organizing this, and it is certainly an interesting time. Every time we have a forum like this, something happens on the outside, and it becomes very, very interesting. Let me just try to give a kind of overview of how we got here and what really has been going on. And as usual, I'm going to use my crutch, my slides, so that I can at least leave you with some numbers that can perhaps give an understanding of what's going on. All right, can you see my screen? Okay. Yeah, so I think where we are right now is, I think the internal dynamics within Malaysia arising from the 2018 election results by the win by Pakatan Harapan, I think caught many people by surprise, in the sense that while the vote share of the opposition back then, Pakatan prior to that, has been gradually increasing, many people, I think, especially ethnic Malays, didn't exactly anticipate that the coalition would win. Indeed, many people inside Pakatan themselves, many leaders of Pakatan also didn't expect to win. And that, I think, perhaps accounts for the very, very optimistic promises unachievable promises set by Pakatan prior to the election, such as doing away with the sales tax, providing free student loans or forgiving student loans, and increase subsidies to the Malaysians prior to the election. And then suddenly they found themselves leading a government with the cash cupboards pretty bare. And so they quickly instituted the sales tax, which they had abolished, and then 2 months later brought it back. And I think that in the end precipitated the beginnings of a decline. At the same time, as what Meredith had said, Pakatan Harapan came into the picture with the promise of a more multiracial Malaysia, where the participation of different segments of the Malaysian communities can be displayed for the public and put into government. And one such appointment was the appointment of Tommy Thomas as the Attorney General. And that began, in my point of view, the beginnings of political mobilization by the then opposition, by UMNO as well as PAS, to mobilize Malay support and talk about the issues of Malay interests in political power and the creeping control by non-Malays into the political arena. And this continued, towards the end of 2018 and into 2019, when the Pakatan government tried to ratify some of the international conventions, such as International Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which brought thousands of people into Kuala Lumpur to protest against it, on the premise that such a convention would diminish the special privileges enjoyed by the Malay community, and other conventions would diminish the special role of the Malay sultans, the Malay monarchy. So all of this, I think, galvanized political support and put Pakatan Harapan on the back foot. And then the rest, we can see from by-election results, Pakatan Harapan basically didn't do very well, kept losing one by-election after another, and seemed to indicate that it was losing the ground. So when Barisan Nasional came into the picture in February this year, it came with the promise to unite the Malays. Malay political arena has always been divided into UMNO, into PAS, and subsequently Anwar with his PKR, and then Dr. Mahathir with Bersatu. And at this point in time, Prime Minister Muhyiddin came into the picture and united these three parties in this coalition. So on a superficial, public sense, he has united the Malay political arena and seems to have restored Malay confidence in government. Yes, certainly it is a Malay ethno-nationalist coalition, but the Malay community, which makes up 2/3 of the electorate, has been exceedingly happy with him. But that, I think, doesn't really explain what's going on inside. Muhyiddin's party, Bersatu, is the smallest partner, and yet, it is providing the Prime Minister as well as key cabinet appointments like the Home Ministry, Education Ministry, and the others. And so right now we are seeing the backlash coming from the coalition itself. The intra-coalition dynamics are coming to the fore, where UMNO leaders who join the coalition with perhaps the expectation that they would be treated leniently, through the courts process. Many of them are seeing cases. Some will see the verdicts come out at the end of October, in November. So many of them expected some leniency in the process in return for the support that they've given Muhyiddin, and are increasingly concerned that that leniency is not forthcoming. So this is bringing questions into Prime Minister Muhyiddin's leadership and his ability to keep his allies together, and affects the stability of the overall government. So we can just see from the charts, there are big swings in terms of public opinion, whether the country is headed in the right or wrong direction. I've stressed this chart all the way back to 2013, where there was a small bump at the election back then. There was increased dissatisfaction as the 1MDB case became exposed and Najib was embroiled. in the very public discussion about his improprieties. And then when Pakatan took over in May 2018, there was this euphoric jump that people felt that the country has undergone a reset and that things are going to be better. But as the new taxes came in, as the opposition galvanized support, people who felt the country was moving in the wrong direction, quickly turned south and became negative. And so now with Muhyiddin in the picture, things have improved a little bit, but not by much. And in part, it's because there are a couple of things. Number one, the current government, as well as Prime Minister Muhyiddin, is drawing support only from the Malay part of the electorate. That said, that support is not very deep in the sense that those support is beholden to the political parties that make up his coalition. And again, his party is the smallest, so it's conditional. Second, there's always this ongoing concern that his coalition partners aren't really keen to stay together. And that's what Meredith mentioned. UMNO has decided to stay out from the Pakatan coalition. So this gives rise to concern that the government is inherently unstable. So that gives, at least about a third of the people feeling that political situation remains unstable, as what has transpired yesterday. And the reason is because, despite losing the last 2018 election, UMNO now together with PAS, control nearly 80% of the majority Malay Muslim vote. So together, and without Bersatu, they could win if elections are called. So now I think a lot of leaders in UMNO, particularly those that are not in government, are quite keen to see the government dissolve and fresh elections called so that they then can lead government and do away with Muhyiddin and his intention to have a government that doesn't include kleptocrats and corrupted people. So I think they just want to get back to the business of running the country. And I think this is where things are really stuck right now. Pakatan Harapan, despite having nearly 1/2 of the popular vote in 2018, captured only slightly over 20% of the Malay votes. And this puts them at a very great disadvantage. And in recent times, they have also split up when Bersatu left and Mahathir has formed his own party that's not allied with Pakatan Harapan. So the Malay votes that are sort of aligned with the opposition has dissipated into smaller chunks. And so this, I think, presents a problem. So this is Muhyiddin's approval rating. You can see that Najib, during his time, wasn't a popular prime minister. Mahathir quickly lost support, and Muhyiddin Yassin, is still very high, but drawing largely from the ethnic Malays, but may not necessarily all translate to votes if voting is called, because the votes ultimately go to the political parties. In terms of government performance, this government came into the picture about a week before the lockdown was announced for COVID-19. And it has, I think, quite ably, through the aid of the bureaucrats at the health ministry, controlled the spread of the virus, and I think been given very high marks by the Malaysian public for their handling. And to date, there's only been about 10,000 cases and only less than 1% fatality. And so that has been a strong point on the side of Muhyiddin and his administration. The government has also periodically come out to give financial aid to people. That also helps them in terms of improving the optics of helping those in need and affected by the pandemic. But when we talk about jobs, when we talk about corruption, the scores are significantly much lower. And perhaps as the effects on the economy begin to be felt, such as the end of the debt holiday that's going to happen at the end of this month, I think we're going to see some of these figures go south even further. I just want to end my little short presentation with the situation right now in Parliament and why this allows for Anwar Ibrahim to claim that he can pull support. Barisan Nasional by itself has only about 113 MPs, and this is distributed amongst Barisan Nasional, 42 MPs, Bersatu 30, PAS 18, and the rest. This is GPS from Sarawak. On the side of the opposition, they are split between Harapan, which is 91, and then parties that are sort of aligned with Dr. Mahathir, 18. So if Anwar really could get another 15 or 22 MPs from UMNO to cross over to his side, then technically he could form government, provided that he could get an audience with the king. He's able to demonstrate that he has support. At which point, I think then the prime minister also has a chance to showcase whether he has support. And then, the king will then have to decide whether to allow transfer of power or to allow the prime minister to dissolve parliament. So this is, I think, the thing that we're looking at for today, perhaps going into the weekend. But the king is unwell. He is undergoing medical checkup, so he can meet with Anwar today, I suppose, or perhaps the next couple of days. So we will see how many of those people that are, that Anwar claims to have given him support will remain there perhaps until next week. I think behind the scenes there's a great deal of horse trading and negotiations trying to maintain support, and all of this occurring at the time when the Sabah election is going on. There are three possible scenarios of what's going on right now. Anwar could well get what he wants, or Mohideen could dissolve parliament if he really couldn't withhold support, and therefore allowing Najib and perhaps Zahid of UMNO to get what they really want out of this process. Or things can muddle along until the next parliamentary session when, the prime minister has to get a majority to pass the national budget as it gets tabled in November. So I'll end here and answer questions that are related to this.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ben. And over to you, Sharad.
Yeah, thanks, Ben and Meredith, for setting the scene. It's actually, I'm not entirely sure what I can bring to the table, except to say as a journalist, one of the things I've been concerned about is how we think through the issues and the terms that we use, right? So when we talk about a new Malaysia or reform, and democracy and so on and so forth, what actually is meant and how that meaning of those multiple kind of ways in which we understand those terms perhaps shape behavior, support for political parties, individuals and such. So what I would like to say of those who haven't been watching Malaysia for very long, the expression new Malaysia might seem kind of novel. It suggests a clean break from the past, and that this extraordinary moment in 2018 in many ways came out of nowhere, when in fact we go back a decade or more ago, there was also this term, and social scientists were picking this term up, new politics, and new politics was was meant to both capture what was happening on the ground in terms of breakthroughs, electoral breakthroughs that we had in 2008, so on and so forth, capturing states, but also was supposed to be an analytical tool. I mean, it purported to be a way of looking at how politics was shaping. So it sort of had a kind of analytical, made some analytical claims, but it also had some sort of normative dimensions to it, right? So I think this idea of breaking with the past is very important because it also, in many ways, shapes how middle-class Malaysians, the chattering classes, view what's happening and how they are either mobilized or not to support political parties. Now, in fact, what happened yesterday, which really consumed much of my day, unfortunately. I was supposed to be on leave, and then we had begun the night before with a rumor, and if you're interested in rumors, that Anwar was going to be offered the deputy prime ministership, and so this was going through the our newsroom, and everybody was mobilized to focus on this politics, and I was checking around. Asking individuals I knew who were close to Anwar about whether that was what they saw happening. And what transpired, in fact, was something quite different. What we saw at the press conference is not so much the announcement of Anwar being inducted into the Mohideen government, or whatever the rationale of that would have been, but that he was making a bid for power, and of course, that sort of changed the way we as journalists were looking and talking to people, like exactly how was he going to achieve this? Had the numbers moved? Why was it that he at the press conference didn't have his allies, traditional or new, with him? Was this reminiscent of an earlier bid? Actually, he's about 12 years old now. Everybody mentions it as if he's doing this every couple of weeks, but it was in 2008 that he also spoke about the possible mass crossover of MPs in order to support a reform government of that time. So, but what we see in this bid, very interestingly, Meredith already mentioned it, was the support letter coming from the president of UMNO was really what made this bid sound significant or real, that somehow there was something behind this and that the needle would have changed, the dynamics. But whether it was the Sarawak coalition, which is actually a rebranded coalition of political parties that were part of the Barisan Nasional, but in Sarawak, now seemingly independent, states-based and states' rights kind of champions, they're essentially all forces associated with the former chief minister of Sarawak, who held on to power in that territory for longer than Mahathir was prime minister first time round, and also is associated with massive corruption. And so even if Anwar didn't go with Zahid Hamidi, now president of UMNO, and perhaps a man for whom there are multiple corruption charges against him, even if he went with GPS, we still would have a problem in terms of, and this is a question that was used recently on my shows by Michael Vertikotis about the Thai protest, of the enduring purity of the reform movement, right? So I think a lot of Malaysians try to hold on to the idea that this break from the past, that the political parties associated with it are somehow pure of the kind of messy, contradictory, paradoxical trade-offs that need to be made in capturing federal power. And so yes, I mean, like a couple of years ago when when Anwar Ibrahim and Mahathir shook hands in that court and sealed a pact to dislodge Najib Razak, we came to accept that Dr. Mahathir was somehow on the side of the good, that he could somehow be part of this coalition of the pure against the corrupt. And we're forgetting, of course, that for 20 years, the Reformasi movement or the reform movement had vilified Dr. Mahathir and made him emblematic of what was deeply wrong about the system. And so, in fact, in an interview I did with Dr. Mahathir, I asked him if Najib Razak, the man at the center of power until the last election, I said, isn't he your political child? It was the only time Mahathir actually smiled in that interview, and he said no. And he said it in a kind of way that you couldn't dispute. I mean, but people might say that Najib, in fact, and the corruption in UMNO and the business of politics as we do it in Malaysia really was shaped in many ways by a man who then had come, in the last couple of years, come to be associated with, not with the bad of Malaysia, but all that is good, and an attempt to, break with the past and develop something important for Malaysia. I think the other point I think I would make is that in talking about Malaysia the last couple of years, especially during that period when we did have the election, was this idea that that we were part of a global narrative as well. If you remember, there was a rise of populist parties. Some of Malaysia, through elections, and Malaysia became part of the slogan that elections do matter, and participation in the democratic system, however attenuated it might be in Malaysia, is still productive, it's important. And this was, we became a beacon of some sort, of the possibilities of pushing against, the kind of tide of populism and becoming and the democracy was important again. Now, at that point, I think there were already voices signaling that we had a problem, that this breakthrough suddenly pushed us from the discourse of the kind of purity into the realm of actual governance and what might the trade-offs that might have to be made in terms of actual governance. Remember William Case, who is an academic based in a Malaysian university. He came out very early on saying, you know, if we push too fast, too quickly, and I think making reference to the reform movement and the new government, that there would be a backlash. And what happened then was then he was vilified by the chattering classes of somehow pouring cold water on this movement, that he was a naysayer. He didn't realize that Malaysians had made this break and they didn't want anything of the past. And we were now, you know, firmly with this reform agenda. And I think, you know, because he's come to be, I mean, it's come very clear that there was a lot in what William said, not necessarily that he was right in terms of strategy, that the new government shouldn't have pushed so fast, so quickly, so deeply, but that there was going to be a reaction to what happened, and that many of us had mistakenly or misunderstood what had happened in 2018, that what it meant, this break from the past, meant different things to different people across the country, and that their commitment to this change it was going to vary. And so the swing back to Pakatan, and Ben explains a little bit about what that dynamic is, isn't simply about the manipulation of UMNO and the Islamic Party and reactionary forces and right-wing ethno-nationalists, but actually the fact that people didn't all agree about what they wanted achieved by the breakthrough. And so I think that, you know, it sets up a whole series of questions. And Meredith came on my show to talk about some of these questions, including how do you really reform the system? What exactly do you do? How do you do it? What do you do first? What do you do last? What were the different types of reforms and changes that we wanted? What were the low-hanging fruit rather, and what would be much more difficult because they were embedded in social and cultural practices that weren't going to go away very quickly. So if you look at some of the, and I think there's a book to be written about all the different controversies produced during the 22 months, and one of them was the child marriage law, and you know that then you see in that this impatience that the middle class, the urban-based middle classes were gripped by when thinking about Pakatan Harapan. So some of the harshest critics of Pakatan Harapan were in fact its staunch supporters, who said, you know, you should have done this yesterday, and there's no negotiation on things like child marriage. But did we really understand what child marriage is in terms of its embeddedness in social lives? And it's not, you know, I mean, people kind of mistakenly think that this child marriage thing is all about sort of right-wing or ultra-conservative Muslims, and this is not necessarily true. You know, Christian Sabah is a state where many child marriages take place. They contribute significantly to those numbers. And it's about rural life, and it's about, you know, life chances and so on and so forth by Christian natives in Sabah. And correct me if I'm wrong about this. But so what I think was happening was there was a lack of clarity about what we wanted as a political community in talking about change. And these come up over and over again in terms of how Pakatan sought to wrestle with the question of governance. For instance, university autonomy. So you have this big problem with university autonomy, because when it comes to public universities, there was a push to to have, give universities autonomy, but that would have meant, in effect, giving universities over to the old order who were in charge, who were well placed to take advantage of the transition to autonomy. And so what some advocates were saying, that in fact, you first had to have a purge. You'd really had to change the leadership first and then institute autonomy. But it was very difficult to fight this, the discourse of, of these principles, these high principles that were adopted by Pakatan Harapan became really a real albatross around their necks, because they couldn't make the effective argument for how change was going to happen. If you look at the government-linked companies, there was also another problem. There's the idea that we wouldn't have political appointees. But if you want to reform something like a government-linked company, how do you begin? Do you begin first by putting in place a reform-minded individual who is a political appointee, because mostly, in terms of talent available and commitment to the changes, who would you choose? Who was going to lead the reform of the GLC if it wasn't going to be somebody who was politically aligned or had the same values as the ruling government, at least broadly? So the fear that GLCs might be used by the new government and its allies to milk the system as it's been done for decades, that was a real fear. But at the same time, how would you do reform without those people? And who would you give the GLCs over to, if not for, to, what was it, neutral parties, people who were non-aligned? Would they be the best people to lead political reform? And so I think for me, what is going to continue to be a problem for the democratic movement, to the extent that we're interested in democracy. I think democracy can be salvaged. Its problems, whatever problems there may be in liberal democracy, if there's something we aspire to, how would we do it? Okay, and finally, I'd just like to say that many of us, I think many observers, were in a binder as to how to describe this 22 months or what was happening. Was it just a new government? Or were we seeing a transition from authoritarianism, soft authoritarian, whatever you want to call it, to a more democratic Malaysia and out to democracy? And what was required in that transition period to make that transition effective and long-lasting? I had been asked to interview Anwar Ibrahim in a closed-door session very early on after the elections, and by an American organization, kind of a World Movement for Democracy, and they had people represented from Tunisia, Czechoslovakia, many experiences of transitions. And my first question to Anwar Ibrahim was, is reversal possible? And he was adamant it wasn't. And I thought it was extraordinary, because we were in a room where so much of the historical experience of this attempt to transit from authoritarian to democracy had in fact failed, that they were more likely to fail than we were to succeed. Then my follow-up question was, whether he would see, he imagined there could be realignments in terms of political forces in the country. He was very unhappy with me with that question, because it suggested that things weren't stable, that these blocks were permanent, they were ideologically homogenous, that everybody in the Pakatan Harapan bloc itself thought alike. And of course that's not true, and it's come to pass that what Anwar refused to engage with, even in that private closed-door session, has come back to bite all of us, and him in particular, in the proverbial bum. So I'm going to end with that.
Great, thank you. Because I'm hoping we can go a little bit over, but we don't have that much time for questions. I think that all of you have highlighted different dimensions, and I have so many questions, and I'd love to hear from both Ben and Meredith of, do you buy Sharad's comment that there was a large part of this was backlash from voters, or do you think it was elite politics? For one question, I'd love for people to grapple with. And I have a couple questions that I just want to throw out here. One is to you, Sharad. The idea of new politics may be unfortunately premature, given that politicians of all sides, and you've sort of gone through this, are playing on division politics. We are still being offered the same candies to subvert racial xenophobia. So you've already pretty much addressed that. Another question is, thanks to your insightful perspectives, the question is, to what extent, in what ways is multiculturalism invoked in this chapter of Malaysian politics? Has Malay ethno-nationalism so dominated the debates that leading politicians or candidates no longer even pretend to claim a multicultural platform? And that is whether this is exacerbating communal politics or not. It would be great for all of you to comment on that. And then one last one, and then everybody can go around and talk to each other. Why do Malaysian voters seem to go back to familiar personalities and their baggage, i.e. Mahathir and Anwar? So I don't know who wants to start. Meredith, why don't you sort of give us an overview of what you think of those questions?
Okay, I was going to try and punt it to somebody else, but all right. I think none of these have straightforward answers. So the question of backlash or elite politics, I mean, Ben showed that I love, because they're just so crazy, those charts of the going in the right direction, the wrong direction. There's incredible peaks and valleys and switches, and how quickly support for Pakatan just plunged, where you know that it's unstable, when so soon, really, after the transition, you have, if I remember correctly, support levels for, going in the right direction that are lower than they were at the low point, the nadir for Najib, and so in that sense, I think a lot of this gets back to something that both Ben and Sharad mentioned, which is really just a lack of consensus. There's this idea that a democratic election conveys a mandate. This is a language you get in Singapore all the time very clearly. It's a language that Mahathir used for all those years under BN, that you vote once in 5 years and that gives a mandate, and that's democracy. That's why Malaysia does not claim to be authoritarian, and the term of art within political science, we can have authoritarian, this question of whether there had been regime change that Sharad raises, I argue that no, that it takes more than the election, but part of that is because the election itself, it conveys some sort of mandate. But when you have a clearly divided electorate, and when the election in some ways glosses over rather than resolving what are important splits in terms of what the priorities of the state should be, whose interests should dominate, what policies are priorities, what sort of reforms are good versus bad, because any reform, it may benefit some, but it's likely to disadvantage some others. That the mandate just conveys, thou shalt now rule. It doesn't say what a party or coalition should really do in order to represent the entirety of the population and not just the voters who elected them. And so in that sense, I think it's impossible to separate out how much of these current machinations have to do with shifts in voter support versus elite politics, because those things are so intertwined. And to some extent, voter support follows what elites are saying or what they're doing or what's on offer. And so that gets us also to this question of the multiculturalism versus Malay ethno-nationalism, which is a really fantastic question. So officially, there is no party or coalition in Malaysia that will say that they're not also going to try to get non-Malay votes. Because as Ben noted, it's about 2/3 Malay, but then there are all these other people who aren't Malay. Or even in Sabah and Sarawak, yes, a larger proportion of Bumiputra, but that's not the same thing as saying Melayu. It's not, it's a really different demographic mix. And so to win, especially given years of gerrymandering and redistribution that created a lot of ethnically mixed seats, in which at the time only the BN could really contest well, all parties will say that they want all votes, right? And yet, I mean, this kind of echoes, maybe it's overly US-centric, but all votes matter versus Malay votes matter. And so I think there's a real shift in the emphasis. And so it's not that ethnocentrism has overwhelmed multiculturalism, but I think it's forced a rearticulation of what that really means beyond capturing a vote. In other words, what policies are actually open to amendment without a coalition's losing power for doing so, in order to shift the emphasis, if indeed that's the consensus. And if the consensus among the voters, enough to build a coalition and to maintain power, is that a Malay ethno-nationalist government is the way to go, that may end up being what happens. It's just not clear to me that that is actually enough to maintain, maybe to win, but not to maintain a stable government. And so one of the most obvious thing that happens, if you think of Ben's chart of the array of parties, and well, this many from UMNO could shift over. If there is a new coalition by the end of this webinar, it won't be any more stable than Perikatan was, and it'll be less so than Pakatan or Barisan was. And then the last question about going back to familiar personalities, if somebody can answer that, I would love to know myself. I mean, there's so much baggage. I think there is something to be said for a known quantity. Mahathir had, that sort of gravitas of having been the developmentalist leader, the early days of new politics, of this sort of a different mode of politicking that would focus on, a different developmentalist ethos and so forth. But at the same time, these are people who have a known history. I mean, Anwar has all sorts of baggage because he's taken on different personas over time, but you could say that for so many. So it's been one of those things that just endlessly flummoxes me as an observer of Malaysia. I don't know if it's because I'm not Malaysian. So let's, again, Ben or Sharad maybe can answer that.
Ben, would you like to, you could even start with personalities and then go backwards, if you don't mind, on the other questions of multiculturalism versus ethno-nationalism and what's really...
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this. I think the prominence of personality in politics, goes back to the traditional structures in Malay society, in part because, it is, I think, underneath the facade of Westminster democracy, there still is the traditional structures of leadership as well as patronage that underpin the political structures here. So personalities like Mahathir and Anwar, clearly gained their stature by A, dispensing patronage to their supporters when they were in power, and B, eliminating any kind of potential rivals that could challenge them in their desire to maintain power. And Mahathir, I think, did it so successfully in his 40, 50 over years of political career. And so they have, I think, eliminated all other rivals that could be alternatives to them, and therefore have just been the single symbol for whatever they stood for. And for Mahathir as well as Anwar. And I think this is an image that they have all cultivated for decades. So it makes it very difficult, I think, at this juncture for us in Malaysia to look at who else, would fill in the position. There are certainly other leaders in UMNO or perhaps even in the opposition that can aspire to become prime minister, but no one else seems to have developed that, kind of all-encompassing image of, personalizing the concept of what they mean. So Mahathir comes into the picture with developmentalism and a more autocratic, leader knows best kind of attitude. Anwar is a little bit of that, but also someone who's a bit more liberal, who's more open to the West and introducing new ideas. At the same time, because it's a crowded arena and it's a competitive arena, both sides try to undermine one another. And we can see this play out inside, Pakatan during the 22 months they were in power, where, Mahathir refused to name Anwar as a successor. And I think in many ways, created the conditions for the whole Sheraton move, the move to organize this coup to take place. And the only thing was that somehow he fell off the bus when it took a turn. So personality certainly will be there. And we can see sort of right now, Muhyiddin is also trying to cultivate a certain, I wouldn't say a cult of personality, but a certain image of a senior father figure that has been able to handle the country, put the country in safe hands and so on. So we see this methodology, this leadership style going in there. And I think perhaps why this is so is because the politics are so complex, there's a lot of competing, undercutting interests, and the politicians need to simplify this for the public at large. And so by putting out this persona, they hide the fact that they are having great issues trying to accommodate the interests of their coalition partners, both on the side of Anwar as well as Mahathir and now Muhyiddin. I think this also goes on to the multiculturalism question that I put. I think this is very, very important because when we look at the Malaysian political typology, there is a clear dichotomy between Malay Muslims that are more multicultural oriented and those that are more conservative, Malay nationalists or Islamists to that extent. And what we've seen is that at least 75% or so are decidedly conservative and nationalist, with within that group, 30% or about a third are more Islamically orientated, which leaves that the more liberal or sort of left-leaning Malay political voter accounts for about maybe 25%. And that, I think, for us right now is all the Malay support that the opposition can hope to capture right now. So multiculturalism is a lip service they pay in order to make the majority of the taxpayers, i.e. ethnic Chinese, to be assuaged, not happy, assuaged, but at the same time, everybody's trying to get at the Malay vote. And I think this will intensify in the coming years because the government has lowered the voting age to 18 and thereby expanding further the size of the Malay electorate. Now, I think expanding the Malay electorate alone doesn't necessarily mean that it's all going to be about ethnic politics, partly because I think as the electorate becomes more dominated by one ethnic group, then the internal issues become more prominent. And I suspect that as time passes and perhaps as the effects of the pandemic on the economy begins to be felt in the political arena, we will see differences emerge along class, perhaps region. We also notice that gender, I think, is an important role as well, because within Muhyiddin's coalition right now, you have the Islamic Party, which have dialed down their Islamic State aspirations, but certainly still has never put that aside. I think that causes a bit of concern among Malay voters, especially Malay Muslim women voters going into the future. What will happen now? Will a new coalition emerge with Anwar, or if, let's say, Parliament is dissolved and we have snap elections, what sort of realignment will take place? I think it will pretty much be like what Meredith said, that we are never going to get very far from where we are, largely because there is one very big dominant block of voters that people have to accommodate, and therefore they have to pander to that gallery.
Thank you. So I want everybody to speak again, and I'm just going to add a couple more questions if you can include that in your closing remarks. One is so-called Islamism is an undercurrent across party lines. You just talked about this a little bit, Ben, but the question is for where there are areas of consensus, it should be thought of in terms of threats to secularism and reforms. I'm not following this question. This isn't just an elite power grab. She's saying that the Islamism is an important undercurrent. She wants your comments on that. Robin Bush, hello Robin, has asked about the sharp change in policy on the Rohingya refugees in recent months. Najib and Mahathir had expressed support, and now that seems to have changed. What are your thoughts on why? And the last question you can wrap in is Malay ethno-nationalism becoming more feasible, and you also touched on this, Ben, because of Malaysia's changing demographics in favor of the Malay population. So, Sherard, I'd love for you to pick up and wrap all these questions up.
Yeah, okay. So there's just so much happening. I want to just, people don't know, Mahathir once said it many times, but he said it while he was Prime Minister of Pakatan Harapan. I mean, the best formula, as it were, for leadership is to make everybody equally unhappy. And, it was very hard to kind of like rally around this idea of making everybody equally unhappy. But because, the man really understands politics in some ways, right? And maybe much more than many of us do, for us because what we do is we conflate democracy with a range of other goods, political goods that don't necessarily come together. So we assume that democracy will lead to better governance, that it will put the right people, rather than some of the absolute bozos that we have in government. We've had bozos in and we now know you can be a complete idiot and be, on the Pakatan side, or you can be a complete idiot and be on Barisan Nasional. I mean, none of them are immune from choosing complete idiots to run the country. So the question is, what does democracy really do? And what is it we have to accept if we are committed to Democrats? What is it that we think any of these things will do? And also on the question of, whether you call it Islamism or you call it regionalism, I think those things are almost as important. The forces, and discourses coming out of Sabah and Sarawak, an equal challenge to Democrats based in Kuala Lumpur. Think the entire country is pretty homogenous when it comes to political literacy or aspirations and the like. So it is very noisy, and the country's gotten even more noisy as a consequence of, and perhaps even more democratic. And maybe, we just recognize the democracy because we wanted democracy to be something else. This transition to a better Malaysia, we could, and I think this is why, even if we are run in some ways by elite politics, that itself for me is not a criticism. So yeah, I mean, elite politics is everywhere, and no less in democracies, right? And so the question really has to be for Malaysians: what is it that we think any government can achieve? And I know, it's a subject for an entire show, but, not a show, but a webinar, which is, what does Muhyiddin want? I mean, he's become prime minister, so what does he want? I mean, it's the same thing about Anwar. So Anwar wants to become prime minister, but then what? What does he want to do? He wants to deliver certain goods. He wants to have policies that are pro, the working man, working woman. Muhyiddin wants to be a prime minister of consequence. I think that would be fair to say. I mean, I don't think he just wants to have a party that he, and wear the crown. So what can we reasonably expect from them? And in terms of I think Malaysians have to clarify. There are a lot of ways in which we talk about politics that perhaps come back and haunt us. So I can leave it there. Is that enough? As a response.
Great. Meredith, can we, like 2 minutes, and then I'm going to have to close it up. And Ben, sorry, you could have 2 minutes too if you want.
Okay, so I'll unmute myself. So very quickly on Robin's question about the Rohingya, I'm not sure exactly. I think some of that is COVID, that there was a sort of backlash against migrant workers and basically anyone who is not a Malaysian citizen during the MCO in particular, but that it is a really dramatic shift from being kind of a safe haven to being not at all. In terms of, so the questions on like youth and where that brings,
yes,
I find that really a fascinating question. So my first thought when Syed Saddiq set up Muda was, why another party? And I'm actually more encouraged by the fact that they're actually thinking through what's the best way to position this organization as a party or not. As some of you may remember that Keadilan started in the same vein as a social movement that turned into a party. I think some of this gets to the point Ben was making about the internal divisions within the Malay vote, and especially for those who are building or really establishing their careers or still in their education in the COVID era, in a time of a terrible economy. The fact of this organization and of an attempt really to articulate a youth voice might remind younger voters, Malay and otherwise, but especially amongst the Malay majority, that their priorities may not be the same as their parents, that an ethno-nationalist policy may not open the same sorts of economic or other opportunities that a different orientation might, that their interests simply might not align in the same ways. So if a vote for Muda as an organization or a party is by definition not a vote for the parents' party, not just following the family trend, that suggests, since it's at least for now attempting to be issue-oriented and about a perspective rather than about an ethnic position or something else, that may help bring issues to the table. I'm still trying to decide where if I were to advise this party, which won't happen, like whether I would say stay an organization or a party. As a party, because of Malaysia's system and the need for coalitions, its parliamentary system and so forth, as a party, Muda risks either not breaking through with first past the post voting at all and not getting seats, because these are less well-known individuals, they're younger, all the things that Ben was talking about, or just being swallowed up by a larger party, much as we're seeing now for Bersatu, most likely, or something like that. But as an organization, it's possible that the established parties might then court established leaders within Muda and bring them and their issues into parties. In other words, it might be a way to shake up the status quo by bringing issues and a set of principles and perspectives to the fore. That said, there may also be power aspirations on the part of some of those who are involved, not specifically not naming names because this is just speculation, such that may be a hard thing to do. It's nice to set up a party, but I think in light of models dating back to history in Indonesia and Thailand, elsewhere now and previously, of youth really trying to bring a new political vision, this might be a good time to try this in Malaysia as well.
Absolutely. Ben?
I'll just going to try and answer about the Islamism. I think, there are two, I think, underlying trends regarding the Islamization in Malay society in Malaysia. Number one, this is an outgrowth of what happened back in the 70s, but it has taken a life of its own. And it has already, immersed society, and things are basically happening by itself. So when we look at the survey data, we do notice that the younger generation profess more socially conservative points of view, have high support for full-scale implementation of Sharia compared to the older generation. And for example, support for the introduction of the Hudud, Islamic Criminal Code, has intensified over the last 10, 12 years. That, when we first started our polling center, we noticed about 48% of Muslims support it. Now it's, averaging about 78, 80%. So outwardly, there is increased support for more Islam being implemented in public life. How much of this is real? How much of this is manufactured? My sense is it's a picture of both. It feeds off each other. Society has also changed, so leaders need to be in line with expectations. And so we see that Islamism definitely is going to be there. And therefore, new parties that are emerging, such as Pejuang, Mahathir's party, or Syed Sadiq's Muda organization, also probably has to account for the shifts in the value systems of society. And therefore, I wouldn't say they need to pander, but they somehow have to find a way to accommodate and speak the same language that these voters expect. And perhaps, talk about the values that underpin the more public displays of Islamism. I think I also want to end that this increased, how shall we say, desire for more Islam in public life, is double-edged. On one side, it does in some ways pose a threat to liberalism, multiculturalism, as well as secularism. But at the same time, we also notice that it has heightened the sense of rule of law, particularly within Malay society. So people are a bit more aware about fairness, about corruption, about justice. And in some ways have pushed the authorities. We've seen at grassroots level push against local authorities on corruption against petty traders or some sort. So we think that this is a mixed picture, that it could be turned to be a force for good rather than just railroading society towards a more closed and mono-ethnic dominance.
Thank you. I'm just aware that we've run over, and what I find really wonderful is that you all highlighted so interesting themes. So as all of us watch what is unfolding and where it's headed, we'll have many ways from what you all have said, to understand it and make sense of it. So thank you. I'm sure all of our people are joining me in thanking you very much.